Hey guys, in this video we're going to be using the Starwars API, and we're going to be using async await on our fetch. So we'll make sure everything loads before we load our cards, but I wanted to show you this website, Starwars API, and it'll give you people, vehicles, all the films, planets, starships. Today we're just going to do films, people, or vehicles, and so you can see it's pulling from that API, and we're just putting it into some Bootstrap cards here. So nice little parallax background with a stormtrooper, loads up nicely, and then you can select this. If you see it takes a second to load, that's because we're awaiting before we push the data out, because if we try to push this out, we'll get undefined if our data hasn't loaded yet. So that's why we're using async await. So let's get started. So I just have VS Code open here, and I'm going to use live server. So I'm going to close this out in a second once we get our HTML open. So we need a few files, just an index.html, and then we also need a main.js. And inside this HTML, we're going to add some boilerplate. We'll just say Starwars API. Starwars API, and all of that's good, and we can open with live server. All right, so we can go ahead and close this one out. Open up our console here. Okay, awesome. And we're going to use Bootstrap to style everything. With these buttons, we are going to use Bootstrap JavaScript, but everything else is going to be Vanilla JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the Bootstrap CDN for the CSS, and then I'm going to grab the JavaScript for Bootstrap, and then down here I'm just linking my main.css file. So we can close this out. So the first thing I'm going to do, and that text up top, I just created that on Font Meme, and I'll drop a link in the description. So it's actually not very much code. So what I want to do is I want to go up here, get some style tags, and we'll style the body just to put our background in. There we go. It's loaded it in there, and then we're just going to give this no repeat, and we're going to do center cover. So that'll get our image right there, and then we'll give this a height of 100 viewport height, which will give it make it the entire page. And then we just want to make this background attachment fixed. So when we put our cards in, it gives us our parallax effect, and we can scroll past it all. So I am going to push everything in a little bit. So when we're going to use Bootstrap classes for this. So I'm just going to give this a class of container to make sure everything's pushed in nicely. But we are going to center most everything. I'm just putting it all in a container here. So I want a header, and we're going to put that Star Wars font image in. And we're going to give this a class of text center, and we're going to give it a class of PT5, which is padding top 5 Bootstrap, just to push it down a little bit. And inside here we're going to do an A, and we're going to link to HTTPS, and this is going to be swappy.co, which is just the Star Wars API here. Inside here, we're going to have our image, and our source is going to be, I'm just going to copy this link in that I created. Font meme. There we go. Starwars API. Looks really good. And that should clear up our header. Then we're going to do 3 buttons. So we're going to make a div, and we're going to give this the ID of buttons so we can grab it in our JavaScript. And we're going to give it a class, a few classes of text center, and we're also going to give it a class of margin bottom 5. So that'll push everything down a little bit. Inside here, we're going to have a div, and it's going to have a class of button group and a class of button group toggle and a class of padding top 5. Inside here, we're also going to have a data toggle, and this is going to be buttons. So that's going to, our Bootstrap JavaScript is going to grab that and work so that our buttons light up when they're active. And I'll just close this out so we can see what we're doing. So let's make a couple of buttons, label, and we're going to give this a class of button, a class of button large, and a class of button outline light. I don't need that. And inside this label, we're going to have an input, and this is going to be a radio. So these are radio buttons. It's going to be options. This is going to be an ID of films. And we're going to do an autocomplete of off. And this films here is for our label. So that gives us one button there. And then we can do the same thing down here. So we can just copy this, and we'll give this an ID of people and make this people. We'll give this an ID of vehicles and the label vehicles. And now we've got 3 nice little buttons here, and it'll show when it's active. Looks really nice. Okay, so there's that. And I'll comment this, buttons for selection, and then I'll create a div down here with the ID of results and a class of card column. So we're going to put everything in here. This is just going to be an empty div for now, and this is going to be an empty div now, and we'll just call this from our JavaScript, and we'll put the results inside of it that our cards are going to use. So we're using the card class, the card components from Bootstrap. Okay, so all of that looks great. I think that is all we have to have for our HTML. So then we'll start on our JavaScript. So number 1, I'm going to create a variable for our results, document.querySelector, and I'm going to call our results div up here by ID. And then what I'm eventually going to do is I'm just going to output everything in the results, and then I also want to have a document.querySelector, and we're going to look for our buttons, and then we're going to add an event listener, and we're looking for a click. And I'm going to pass in our event variable and do our callback function here. And I'm going to call well, first of all, I'm going to console log just E, make sure everything's working when we select this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a function called async fetch. fetch. And I'm going to pass in e.target.textContent.trim to lowercase. And you'll see once we create this function here, so this is event listener for buttons. So function async fetch, and then we're going to take in a value, which is this, and we'll just console log value. So what this is doing is it's taking whatever text content we have in our vehicles, because that's how we're going to determine what we put in our cards. So this is taking in the text content, and we're trimming off any white space on the end, and then we're pushing the entire thing to lowercase, and we're eventually going to add that when we fetch in this next part coming up. We're going to use this value to determine which API call we use, or what the URL of the API is. So this should be an async function, and then inside here, when we get our data, we're just going to use await. So it's going to await and make sure that everything is loaded before we do anything. So const res or result equals await fetch, and we're going to use string literal here so we can put in the value of this. So what we'll do is we'll call the API, Starwars API .co, and then /API / and here we're going to insert our variable. But if we just put in value and we refresh our page, it's not going to get anything, because we're just calling the value. So we're doing this, so we want to make sure there's something inside here before we call it. So nothing, let's see, actually, I think I can just / is the problem. Okay. Then we'll get our data, const data equals await, so we're going to await to make sure this finishes, because this returns a promise. So we want to take this, do res.json, so we have our data in manageable form, and then we'll just console log our data. Let's see here. Yeah, so that's working perfectly. We're getting our data in here. Looks perfect. Okay. And we're not going to use this next. This is going to be if we want to add additional pages. You guys can do that on your own, play with doing pagination there, but we're not going to do it in this one. So we have our data, and just so I can keep this function clean, I'm just going to call another function called display results, and I'm going to pass in our data and our value, because we're going to need to know what this value is so we can display the correct things. If you see here, we have results, and this has title, and then these in here have names. So we need to be able to understand what we're going to call. So we're going to have a few if statements in here. So display results is just going to be a standard function. It's going to take in the data and the value. So basically what we're doing here is function. What we're doing here is we're just making sure that all of this goes through, and that's what the await does. It just makes sure that our promise is fulfilled before we move forward. So this data isn't going to be empty when we try to call this display results, because we're awaiting the promise on this. So this data is always going to have what we need it to have, because we're making sure our promise is filled before we're moving forward. If you just use a standard fetch, then you would have to do something like .then to make sure your data actually had some value in it. So that's why we do that. So for here, I wanted to declare a variable called output, and this is eventually what we're going to put into our HTML. So we're just going to add it as HTML. And then I want to do a couple of if statements, or we'll do one right now and then we'll copy it. So if value equals films, and then what we'll do is we'll take these results, let's console log our data. So this is our data. We're needing to get results, and then since this is an array, we can iterate through this. So we're going to say if value equals films, data dot results dot for each. So we want to take this data dot results, and then we want to go over each one and get the name, etc., and we'll do that here. So we're going to go through, there's a callback function, and for every item we want to add some kind of HTML to our output. And then down here we want to take our results variable, which is this empty div we created, and then do inner HTML equals output. So for this, we'll say for each item we want to add some kind of HTML to our output. So output plus equals, because we want to keep track, and we'll just do a template literal or a string literal here, and we'll put our HTML in here. So we're going to have a div, and it's going to have the class equal to card. We're going to give it padding 3, so padding on every side 3, margin on every side of 3, and we're going to give it a style, an inline style, which I don't generally like to do, but it's great for situations like this, and we're just going to give it an opacity of 0.8. And then we'll close this div off. My emmet doesn't work in here, so I can't pre-fill any of this here, but we'll do an h4. Close that off, and we'll give this h4 a class of card title. These are bootstrap classes. We'll give it a class of text center, and we'll put our variable in. So we're going to take our item dot title here. So perfect. That's exactly what we want. We have results and then title, and then we'll take a few of these things, the director, the producer. We just got the title, so we'll put these in, and we'll do a div here. And this will have a class of card content, and we'll do a few of our lines now. So we want to do a span, and we want to give a little bit of underline here just to make sure we differentiate between the titles. So text decoration underline, and we want to say the producer is, close our span off, And the producer is, put a variable in, item dot producer. So there we go. So we have our films. What we did with this span, I actually just want to add a space there. What we did with this span is we just put the underline there so it looks a little bit nicer. You can drag it out here. Looks nice. So we want a few other things. We want the producer, we want the director. We got to get George Lucas's name in there somewhere. So I'm going to put a line break here, and then I'm just going to copy this down a couple more times. So for here we want director, item.director, and we'll check that out. So now we have our director here, and then I want to do release date, item.release date. So now we have our release date. We're just getting that from results, and then on each one we're getting director. Like we could do episode ID, and then we're going to do opening crawl. So down here we're going to do a paragraph tag. Oops. And we're going to give this a class of text center. And all the other ones are going to be very similar to this. So we're just going to copy those two. So now we have item.opening crawl. So now we have these nice little cards here that show a few things. And we don't have these yet, so we'll add these. And what I'm going to do here is, this one is done. So now for each one, this is what we want to do. We want to add the results.inner.html equals output. So we can just copy this, because either way, it's only going to give us the output we need. And every time we click the button, it's going to reset our output back to an empty string here. So since we don't have any in there, it's going to reset each time, so we're not stacking tons of cards on top of it. If you wanted to add extra pages, you would just have to keep track of your pages, and your output would have to erase before you did your other pages. So let's do this. If value equals people, value equals vehicles. So now we can see it's going to output the same thing. Oops. Well, it actually doesn't have it. The reason it's not outputting anything is because it's not going to find any of that in here. Films dot for each item, item dot name. And that should give us our, there we go, Luke Skywalker, vehicle, snowspeeder, awesome. So what we want in here is we have our names. Instead of that, we want maybe the height of the person. We'll put in height and do item.height. In here we want birth year, and inside here we want birth year. Instead of release date, we want skin color, and I only wanted that for Obi-Wan Kenobi, or C-3PO, because it's gold, which I thought was kind of cool. And we'll leave it at that on this one, since we don't have this opening crawl. If we leave it how it is, it's going to give us an undefined here. So we don't want that. Okay. So now it has skin color fair, skin color light, gold. I like that one. Blue and white for R2-D2. Okay, so we have our people, and now vehicles. We'll do let's see, maybe the capacity item dot cargo capacity, and we can do something like kilograms. I don't know what it is, but seems right to me. Director, instead of director, we want something like what model is it? So item.model, we can do manufacturer, item.manufacturer, and then let's do vehicle class. So we'll delete that paragraph. We'll just do another one of these spans, and we'll say vehicle class, and this is going to be vehicle class. Okay, we can get rid of this console log here. We don't really need that anymore. Awesome. So now we have this. You can see it's a fun little project. We still have R2-D2, or this little stormtrooper in the background here whenever we do it. So that's kind of nice to look at. So nice clean look. We have a little space between each, and I really like the card columns because if these are different heights, then it just staggers them out really nicely. So everything falls in line. It just looks great. So that's our Star Wars API. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, comment, and let me know if there's anything else you want to see. Thanks for watching.